When Eva Miller, a deaf waitress struggling to open a bank account, is publicly humiliated by an arrogant manager who mocks her disability, she never expects her life to change forever in the next 30 seconds. As her dented lunchbox crashes to the floor, a mysterious drawing falls out. A child's artwork that makes a distinguished man in the corner go pale as death. "Where did you get this?" he asks, his hands shaking uncontrollably, tears welling in his eyes. The drawing, a simple carousel scene signed Lily, 1997, belongs to his long-missing daughter. What begins as a moment of public shame explodes into a dangerous journey through decades of buried secrets, corporate conspiracy, and family tragedy. How is Eva connected to this powerful banker's missing daughter? Why was her adoptive mother so afraid? And what deadly truth lies beneath the respectable facade of First National Bank? Follow this channel for more heart-stopping stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Like and comment where you're watching from, and tell us what secret from your past you'd never want revealed. The summer heat in Montgomery, Alabama was relentless that Tuesday afternoon. Even the air conditioning inside the Oakwood Community Bank struggled against it, leaving a film of humidity that clung to everything, including Eva Miller's worn uniform shirt. At 24, with honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands calloused from years of carrying heavy trays, Eva looked like any other exhausted service worker at the end of a double shift. She clutched her dented aluminum lunchbox tightly against her chest as she joined the queue, counting the people ahead of her. 7. The clock on the wall read 4:37 p.m. The bank closed at 5 sun. Her stomach knotted. Would there be enough time? Eva shifted uncomfortably as the weight of stairs pressed upon her. Her faded blue waitress uniform from Rosie's Diner was splattered with cooking oil and smelled faintly of bacon and pancake syrup. She clearly didn't belong among the business suits and smart casual attire of the other customers. But today was her only chance. The diner had finally agreed to direct deposit, but she needed a bank account first, and Tuesday was her only day off this week. When Eva finally reached the front of the line, she pulled out a notepad and carefully wrote, "I would like to open a checking account, please." She pushed it across the counter with a small, hopeful smile. The branch manager, Mr. Coleman, according to his brass nameplate, didn't even look at her note. His eyes flicked from her stained uniform to her face, his thin lips curling slightly. "Can I help you?" he asked loudly, enunciating each word with exaggerated clarity. Eva pointed to her notepad, tapping it twice with her finger. Coleman barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward her. "I'm sorry, we're very busy. Do you have an account with us already?" Eva shook her head and wrote again. "No, I want to open one today." "Minimum deposit?" Coleman demanded, the impatience in his voice rising. Eva hesitated. She had $47 in her wallet, her emergency cash. The rest of her savings was at home, tucked inside an old coffee can. She'd planned to ask about minimum requirements first. When she didn't immediately respond, Coleman's face hardened. "Look, miss, we have customers waiting." From behind her, a man in an expensive suit sighed audibly. "Some of us have actual business to conduct," he muttered, just loud enough for others to hear. Eva felt her cheeks burning as she fumbled with her notepad again, writing quickly, "I'm deaf. Can you please tell me the requirements?" Coleman read it this time, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he leaned forward and spoke with deliberate slowness, as if she were not just deaf, but also unable to comprehend. "We require a minimum opening deposit of $100 for basic checking," he nearly shouted, though Eva couldn't hear him. His exaggerated mouth movements bordered on mockery. "And proper ID. Do you have those?" The humiliation crawled up Eva's neck like fire. She wrote, "I have ID. Can I open with $47 now and bring the rest tomorrow?" Coleman actually laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that made several customers turn their heads. He looked past Eva to the growing line and rolled his eyes theatrically, inviting them to share in his annoyance. "This is a financial institution, not a charity case," he said loudly. "Come back when you can meet the requirements. Better yet," his voice rose, ensuring everyone could hear, "come back when you can actually speak to a teller, or when you have the minimum balance. Tell you what, if you somehow get a balance, I'll pay you double." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the line. A few people shifted awkwardly, eyes averted, while others snickered openly. Eva's hands trembled. She'd faced discrimination before, but something about the public humiliation in this moment when she was just trying to accomplish a simple adult task, broke something inside her. Tears pricked at her eyes as she gathered her notepad, her shoulders hunched against the weight of the stairs. As she turned to leave, her elbow knocked against the counter. The aluminum lunchbox slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. The worn latch gave way, and the lid popped open. Her half-eaten sandwich, an apple, and a folded piece of paper slid across the polished marble floor. The bank fell silent. Eva dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather her belongings, her vision blurred by unshed tears. She didn't notice the tall man who had been standing in the back corner of the bank, observing the scene with growing displeasure. He wore a light gray suit that somehow remained crisp despite the Alabama humidity. Nothing about him demanded attention. His silver-streaked dark hair was neatly trimmed, his tie a conservative blue, yet the air around him seemed charged with quiet authority. As Eva reached for the folded paper, now partially unfolded and stained with a small grease mark from her sandwich, the man in the gray suit stepped forward and bent down. His manicured hand reached the paper before hers. "Allow me," he said, a courtesy Eva couldn't hear. The man began to straighten the paper, likely intending to hand it back when something on it caught his eye. His fingers froze. The color drained from his face. His composed expression crumbled as he stared at the childish drawing on the paper. It showed a little girl with pigtails, holding hands with a blonde woman in front of a carousel. Stick figures, drawn with the loving imprecision of a child. In the corner, written in purple crayon, Lily, 1997. The man in the gray suit swayed slightly, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. His knuckles whitened around the edges of the paper. When he looked up at Eva, his eyes were filled with something raw and broken. "Where?" His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where did you get this?" Eva, still on her knees, looked confused. She couldn't hear him, didn't understand why this stranger was staring at her with such intensity, such naked emotion. The man's hands were shaking now. He tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this drawing?" The entire bank had gone completely still. Coleman, sensing something significant but unaware of what, stepped out from behind his counter. "Sir, is there a problem? I was just explaining to this woman that—" The man in the gray suit rose to his full height, still clutching the drawing. When he turned to face Coleman, there was something dangerous in his expression, a storm brewing behind the careful facade of wealth and position. "My name," he said, his voice now steady and cold as winter steel, "is Walter Reed. I'm the interim CEO of First National Banking Group." His eyes bored into Coleman. "And I believe we need to have a conversation about how you treat potential customers." A collective gasp rippled through the bank. Coleman's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Walter Reed, the man who controlled not just this branch but 200 others across the southeast, turned back to Eva, who was still kneeling on the floor, watching the silent drama unfold without understanding a word. Walter held up the drawing, his fingers trembling slightly. "This," he said, though Eva couldn't hear him, "this is my daughter's drawing, Lily's drawing." His voice broke on the name. She disappeared 28 years ago. The atmosphere in the Oakwood Community Bank had transformed in an instant. The hushed silence that followed Walter Reed's revelation was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every pair of eyes darted between the powerful man in the gray suit and the young deaf woman still crouched on the floor, her belongings scattered around her like fragments of a life most chose to ignore. Coleman, the branch manager, had gone from smug authority to quivering subordinate in the space of a heartbeat. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously as he struggled to find words that might salvage his career. "Mr. Reed, sir, I had no idea you were visiting today. We weren't notified of an inspection," he stammered, his previous condescension replaced by a desperate obsequiousness. Walter didn't even glance in Coleman's direction. His entire focus remained on Eva and the drawing that had transported him back 28 years, to a time when his world had first shattered. A security guard, sensing the gravity of the situation, gently ushered the remaining customers to other tellers or toward the exit, creating a small pocket of privacy in the middle of the bank floor. Eva, still unaware of who exactly this man was or why her mother's keepsake had affected him so deeply, slowly gathered the remaining contents of her lunchbox. Her movements were deliberate, cautious, like someone accustomed to navigating a world that rarely accommodated her needs. Walter knelt down again, his expensive suit pants touching the polished marble without a second thought. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. With trembling fingers, he extracted a worn photograph and held it beside the drawing. The photo showed the same carousel from the drawing, a vintage merry-go-round with ornate painted horses, and standing before it, a teenage girl with chestnut hair and Walter's unmistakable eyes. She was laughing, her arm thrown casually around a blonde woman who must have been her mother. Ava's eyes widened as she looked between the drawing and the photo. The similarity was undeniable. The same carousel, the same figures, different medium, but clearly the same moment in time. Walter pulled out his phone and typed quickly, then showed the screen to Eva. "Where did you get this drawing?" "It was made by my daughter Lily in 1997. Ava's hands moved to her chest in the instinctive sign for sorry, before she reached for her notepad. She wrote rapidly, "It was my mother's. I found it among her things after she died last year." She hesitated, then added, "My adoptive mother." Walter read her words and something shifted behind his eyes, a new possibility dawning, too fragile to fully acknowledge yet too powerful to dismiss. He typed again, "What was your adoptive mother's name?" Eva wrote, "Susan Miller. She raised me alone in Mobile. She never told me much about my birth mother." The bank had grown eerily quiet. Even Coleman stood frozen, watching the exchange with growing apprehension. Walter's fingers flew across his phone screen. "How old are you?" 24, Eva wrote back. Walter did the math in his head. His daughter Lily had disappeared in 1997 at age 17, 28 years ago. Eva was 24. The timing aligned with a possibility too painful, too hopeful to confront head-on. "May I buy you a cup of coffee?" Walter typed. "I'd like to talk more." Eva studied his face, the lines of grief etched around his eyes, the tremor in his hands that betrayed profound emotion. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. Walter turned to address the room for the first time since his revelation. "Mr. Coleman, you're suspended pending review. Please clear your desk by end of day." Coleman's face blanched to the color of printer paper. "Sir, surely we can discuss. We'll discuss your treatment of customers with disabilities, your public humiliation of someone seeking services, and your general unsuitability for a position requiring basic human decency at your review hearing." Walter interrupted, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. "But not today." He turned to his assistant, a young woman who had been standing unobtrusively near the entrance. "Jessica, please have the car brought around. And call headquarters. I'll need my afternoon cleared." The coffee shop across from the bank was a small, independent place with exposed brick walls and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. Walter and Eva sat in a corner booth, a small notepad between them. "I don't want to presume," Walter wrote carefully, "but I need to ask. Do you have any information about your birth parents?" Ava's pen hovered over the paper. "Very little," she finally wrote. "Susan told me my mother was very young when she had me, that she loved me but couldn't keep me. She never mentioned a name." Walter took a deep breath. "My daughter Lily ran away from home in 1997 when she was 17. We had a terrible fight. My fault entirely. She was dating someone I didn't approve of and His pen stalled. "I said unforgivable things." Eva watched his face, reading the pain written there more clearly than any words. "She disappeared." Walter continued writing. "Police searched. Private investigators searched. For years. There were sightings in Mobile, in New Orleans, but nothing concrete, until 5 years later, when we received confirmation she had died. But there were no details, no body, just a death certificate from a small county in southern Alabama." Ava's eyes widened. She wrote rapidly, "My mother, Susan, moved to Mobile from Cullman County around the time she adopted me. She never spoke about it much." Walter's hand trembled as he wrote his next question. "Ava, would you be willing to take a DNA test? I need to know. I need to know if you're my granddaughter." Eva stared at the words on the page. The possibility that had been forming like a ghost between them now solidified into something neither could ignore. She slowly nodded. Back in his hotel suite that evening, Walter sat alone with the drawing propped against a lamp. He stared at it as if it might speak, might offer some explanation for the 28-year void in his life. His phone buzzed with messages from the bank's board members. Coleman had apparently been making calls, attempting to rally support, but Walter ignored them. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched through his personal cloud storage until he found what he was looking for. A folder labeled simply, "Lily." Inside were scanned copies of police reports, investigator notes, and photographs documenting his desperate search for his daughter. And there, in a subfolder he rarely had the courage to open, was a scanned copy of her death certificate. County of death, Coleman. Cause of death, unlisted. And a name he didn't recognize listed as the identifying witness, Susan Miller. Walter's breath caught. The connection was real. Susan Miller, Eva's adoptive mother, had known what happened to his daughter. And somehow, against all odds, his granddaughter had walked into his bank today, carrying a piece of his past in her humble lunchbox. Outside his window, Montgomery's lights twinkled in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in those lights were answers he had sought for half a lifetime. And perhaps, just perhaps, a chance at healing wounds he had long ago accepted would never close. Ava's apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit on the third floor of an aging building in East Montgomery. The rent was higher than she would have liked, but the landlord hadn't balked at renting to a deaf tenant, which made it worth the extra $50 a month. She kicked off her worn sneakers by the door and padded across the faded linoleum to her small kitchenette where she set down her aluminum lunchbox. The events at the bank replayed in her mind like a silent film. The humiliation, the strange man's reaction, the coffee shop conversation that had turned her understanding of her past into a house of cards. Could she really be this wealthy banker's granddaughter? The possibility seemed too fantastical, like something from the paperback novel Susan used to read. Susan. Her adoptive mother had been gone for 14 months now, taken quickly by an aggressive pancreatic cancer that left Eva little time to prepare for a world without her. They'd had their struggles, Susan's drinking, Ava's resentment about the secrets kept from her, but in the end there had been love, imperfect but genuine. Ava's gaze drifted to the closet in the corner of her living room. Inside, stacked in neat plastic bins, were the remnants of Susan's life that Eva hadn't been able to part with yet. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and pulling out the bin labeled personal papers. The cardboard box inside had traveled with them through 3 states and 7 apartments. Susan had always kept it closed with packing tape, changing the tape whenever it began to yellow. Ava had only opened it after the funeral, and even then, had only glanced inside before the grief became too overwhelming. Now she carefully lifted the lid and began to sort through the contents. Birth certificate, Susan's. Marriage license, Susan and Frank Miller, divorced 1998. Old tax returns, a faded black and white photo of grandparents Ava had never met. And at the bottom, wrapped in a faded silk scarf, a worn leather-bound journal. Ava ran her fingers over the cracked cover. She'd seen Susan writing in this sometimes, usually late at night after a few too many glasses of wine. On those nights, Susan would look at Eva with an expression of such complicated sorrow that Eva would have to look away. She opened the journal, the spine cracking slightly. The pages were filled with Susan's distinctive handwriting, tight, controlled cursive that slanted sharply to the right. Many entries were dated, though they jumped irregularly across years. Some pages contained only names and addresses, while others held longer reflections. Eva flipped through, scanning for anything that might connect to Walter Reed or his daughter Lily. On page 17, a name caught her eye. Lily Reed, written and then violently crossed out with ink so heavy it had torn the paper slightly. Next to it, another entry. Walter. Dangerous? Her pulse quickening, Eva turned to the next page. There was a newspaper clipping taped inside, a small article from 1998 about a banking executive's missing teenage daughter. The headline read, "Search continues for banker's daughter." A young Lily Reed stared out from a grainy photograph, her eyes holding the same intensity Eva had seen in Walter's. Susan had circled the name Walter Reed in the article and written in the margin, "He's looking everywhere, not safe." Eva's hands trembled as she turned the page. The next entry was dated October 1999. She came back again today, begging me to let her see the baby. I told her she made her choice. We had an agreement. She needs to stay away, for all our sakes. She doesn't understand what they're capable of, what he's capable of. She thinks because she's his daughter she's safe. She's not. None of us are. Ava's heart pounded against her ribs. The baby, was that her? And she, could that be Lily? Her birth mother? She read on, flipping through pages of cryptic entries and crossed-out names. An address in Mobile appeared several times, as did a reference to someone called the director. On a page dated 2001, Susan had written, "Frank found out about the money. He's threatening to tell Reed everything. I told him what would happen if he did. He doesn't believe me. Men never do. Not until it's too late." The entries grew more scattered after that, with some pages torn out entirely. But on one of the last pages, dated just 2 months before Susan's death, she had written, "I should tell Ava the truth. She deserves to know. But how do I tell her that everything, her mother, her grandfather, even her deafness, it's all connected to what happened at First National? How do I tell her that I saved her life by stealing her? That I loved her mother like the sister I never had? That Reed isn't the monster I made him out to be? Too many secrets, too many lies. The cancer will take them to the grave with me. Maybe that's best. Some truths are too dangerous." Ava closed the journal, her hands shaking. The quiet apartment suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. Susan hadn't just kept secrets. She'd apparently been at the center of whatever happened between Lily Reed and her father. And somehow, it involved the bank. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Ava grabbed her phone and the journal, shoved them into her bag, and headed back out the door. 20 minutes later, she stood in the lobby of the Grand Montgomery Hotel, asking the front desk to ring Walter Reed's room. Walter answered the door to his suite looking significantly more disheveled than he had at the bank. He'd removed his tie and jacket, and his silver-streaked hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. His eyes widened at the sight of Eva. He gestured for her to come in, then reached for the notepad and pen that now seemed to be their primary means of communication. "Is everything all right?" he wrote. Ava pulled Susan's journal from her bag and placed it on the coffee table between them. "I found this," she wrote below his question. "It was my mother's, Susan's. She wrote about Lily, about you. She called you dangerous." Walter's face paled as he reached for the journal with trembling hands. He looked up at Ava, his eyes asking permission. When she nodded, he began to carefully turn the pages. As Walter read, emotions crossed his face in waves. Shock, grief, confusion, anger. He paused longest on the final entry Eva had found, reading it several times before closing the journal gently. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "I wasn't dangerous," he wrote. "At least I didn't think I was. But my father, Lily's grandfather, was the president of the bank then. He had connections, power, and Lily was dating a young man who worked at the bank, someone my father didn't approve of." His pen hesitated over the paper. There was an embezzlement scandal brewing. Millions missing from pension funds. I never knew the details. My father handled it quietly. Ava took the notepad. Susan wrote about the director and money. Could that be connected? Walter's expression darkened. The director of operations at that time was a man named Richard Coleman. Eva's eyebrows shot up. She wrote quickly, "Coleman, like the manager at the bank today?" Walter nodded grimly. His father, the older Coleman, resigned suddenly in 2000. No explanation. But the timing, he trailed off, then wrote with sudden urgency, "Ava, I think your mother, Susan, knew what happened to Lily. I think she was protecting you. From my father. Maybe from me too, though I swear I never knew about any of this." Ava stared at the journal, then at Walter. The connection between them, a possibility just hours ago, now felt solidified by the weight of Susan's secrets. But what exactly had happened? Why had Susan believed Walter was dangerous? And what did all of this have to do with the bank? Walter seemed to read her thoughts. "Tomorrow," he wrote, "we'll go to Mobile, to the address in the journal. We need to find out what really happened to Lily." He paused, then added, "To your mother." Outside the hotel window, thunder rumbled across the Montgomery sky. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively, as decades-old secrets threatened to break the surface like long-submerged bodies, suddenly rising to the light. The storm that had threatened Montgomery all night had finally broken by morning, leaving behind a freshly washed world and air heavy with humidity. Walter's sleek black Audi cut through puddles on I-65 South, heading toward Mobile with Eva in the passenger seat. Between them sat Susan's journal, now as precious as any treasure map, guiding them toward answers buried in the past. Walter had barely slept. After Eva left his hotel suite, he'd spent hours on his laptop, digging through old news archives and company records. His executive access codes still opened most digital doors at First National, and he'd used them without hesitation. ethical concerns eclipsed by the desperate need to understand what had happened to his daughter. He glanced at Eva now, struck again by subtle similarities to Lily, the shape of her jaw, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. Her deafness remained a puzzle piece he couldn't place. Lily had had perfect hearing, but then again, Susan's journal had mentioned that Eva's deafness was somehow connected to everything else. Another mystery to solve. Eva was looking out the window, watching the Alabama countryside blur past. She tied her honey blonde hair back in a simple ponytail and changed from her waitress uniform into jeans and a faded blue t-shirt. The lunchbox that had started it all sat at her feet. She'd insisted on bringing it, though Walter couldn't fathom why. He tapped her arm gently and nodded toward the car's navigation screen, which showed they were about an hour from Mobile. Eva nodded, then reached for the notepad they'd been using to communicate. "What did you find last night?" she wrote. "I could tell you were searching for something before I left." Walter hesitated before responding. Better to be honest. He pulled into a rest stop so he could write without driving. Old news articles about Lily's disappearance. And bank records. His pen paused over the paper. Something strange happened at First National in 1997-98. Large amounts of money moved through offshore accounts. My father claimed it was a system error when questioned by auditors, but the timing coincides with Lily's disappearance. Eva frowned, digesting this. "You think there's a connection?" she wrote. "I don't know," Walter admitted, but the journal mentioned money, and Richard Coleman, the father of yesterday's branch manager, was director of operations then. He would have overseen those transactions. Eva tapped her finger against the notepad thoughtfully, then wrote, "What about this?" She pulled out her phone and showed Walter an email she'd received that morning. It was from James Harland, Walter's assistant at First National. Eva had apparently contacted him while Walter was in the shower at the hotel. The email read, "Ms. Miller, per your request, I've searched our archives for any video footage from company events in 2000-2003 that might show Lily Reed. There's very little from that period, but I did find one recording from a community fair First National sponsored in Mobile in 2002. The attached file is the only clip where someone resembling Ms. Reed appears. I hope this helps. Mr. Reed instructed us to assist you in any way possible." Walter's heart pounded against his ribs. "You found footage of Lily? From 2002? Eva nodded and clicked play on the attached video file. The footage was grainy, obviously digitized from an old VHS tape. It showed a community fair with red, white, and blue banners declaring, "First National supports Mobile." Children ran through sprinklers in the background while adults milled around booths and tables. The camera panned across the crowd, then zoomed in on a young woman with chestnut hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She was standing near a refreshment table, partially turned away from the camera. A baby, perhaps a year old, was balanced on her hip. Walter's breath caught. It was Lily, older than when he'd last seen her, with new lines of strain around her eyes, but undeniably his daughter. As they watched, transfixed, a man's voice called out from behind the camera. "Susan! Susan, over here!" The camera swung to show a blonde woman in her 30s, presumably Eva's adoptive mother, who looked up with an expression of alarm. She hurried over to Lily and the baby, saying something the microphone didn't catch. The two women argued briefly, with Susan repeatedly glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being watched. The baby on Lily's hip began to fuss, and the camera caught a clear view of the child's face as Lily turned to soothe her. Walter froze the video, his finger trembling on the screen. The baby had Lily's eyes, his eyes, and although it was impossible to tell from such old footage, he would bet everything he owned that the child was deaf, that the baby was Eva. "That's you," he wrote, his handwriting shaky. "With Lily. With your mother." Eva stared at the frozen image, her eyes wide with shock. She reached out to touch the screen, her fingertips hovering over the face of the mother she'd never known. Walter started the video again. In the background, a man's voice could be heard arguing with someone else. "I told you they'd be here. You promised me 50 grand to keep quiet about the whole thing, and I want it now." The camera jerked, as if the operator had been startled, and briefly captured the speaker, a balding man in his 40s with a ruddy complexion. "That's Frank," Eva wrote quickly. "Susan's ex-husband. They divorced in '98, but he came around sometimes when I was little, before he disappeared." Walter frowned. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture he didn't want to see. Frank had known something about Lily. something worth $50,000 in hush money. Susan had taken Eva, his granddaughter, and hidden her away. And his own father, along with Richard Coleman, had orchestrated, what? A cover-up? But of what? The video ended abruptly as if someone had shut off the camera. Walter stared at the blank screen for a long moment before putting the car back in drive. They needed to get to Mobile, to the address in Susan's journal. An hour later, they pulled up outside a small single-story house with peeling yellow paint and overgrown azalea bushes, partially obscuring the windows. According to Susan's journal, this had been Frank Miller's last known residence. The house looked abandoned, with newspapers piled on the porch and an ancient for rent sign tilting in the front yard. Walter and Eva approached cautiously, aware they were trespassing but driven by a need stronger than legal concerns. The door was locked, but a quick circuit around the house revealed a bathroom window left slightly ajar. With Eva keeping watch, Walter managed to push it open enough to climb through, then unlocked the front door from inside. The interior smelled of mildew and abandonment. Dust coated every surface and water stains marked the ceiling where the roof had leaked. But what caught Walter's attention immediately were the walls of the living room. Every inch was covered with newspaper clippings, printouts, and hand-scrawled notes, all connected by red string in an elaborate web that spanned the entire room. At the center was a large photograph of First National Bank's corporate headquarters, with Walter's father's face circled in red marker. Radiating outward were articles about pension fund mismanagement, offshore banking regulations, and, Walter's blood ran cold, Lily's disappearance. Scrawled across one article in angry capital letters, "They took her to silence her." Eva tapped Walter's arm and pointed to a section of the wall dedicated to medical records. Amidst the chaos of papers was a document labeled Experimental Antibiotic Trial, Side Effects, with hearing loss in infants, highlighted in yellow. Next to it was a birth certificate. Eva Miller. Mother, Lily Reed. Father, unknown. Walter sank slowly into a dusty armchair, the weight of revelation pressing down on him like a physical force. Eva stood before the wall, her fingers tracing the red strings connecting her birth, her deafness, and Walter's father to the bank scandal Susan had hinted at in her journal. The truth was here, in this room, hidden in plain sight by a man everyone had dismissed as a paranoid drunk. Frank Miller might have been many things, but he'd been right about one thing. There was a connection between Eva's birth, Lily's disappearance, and whatever had happened at First National Bank 28 years ago. And somewhere in Mobile, perhaps at the very address they'd come seeking, were the answers to questions Walter was only now learning to ask. The evening light cast long shadows across the motel parking lot as Walter and Eva returned from Frank Miller's abandoned house. They'd spent hours documenting everything, photographing the wall of evidence, carefully removing key documents, searching through drawers and closets for anything else that might explain what had happened to Lily. Walter had insisted on getting separate rooms at the Bayshore Inn, a modest motel on Mobile Bay. Eva could tell he was trying to give her space to process everything they'd discovered. The truth of her origins was unfolding like a dark fairy tale, more Brothers Grimm than Disney, and each revelation left her feeling increasingly unmoored from the life she'd thought was hers. She sat cross-legged on the floral bedspread, spreading out the documents they'd taken from Frank's house: birth certificate, medical records indicating she'd been treated with an experimental antibiotic as a newborn, the likely cause of her deafness, newspaper clippings about First National Bank's reorganization in 1998, with Richard Coleman's resignation buried in the business section, and a half-finished letter from Frank to a journalist at the Mobile Register, outlining allegations of embezzlement and cover-up but never sent. A knock at the door startled her. Eva checked the peephole to see Walter standing outside, holding a pizza box and 2 sodas balanced precariously in one hand. She let him in with a small smile. They ate in companionable silence, the television muted but providing a flicker of normality in an otherwise surreal situation. Walter had adapted quickly to communicating with her, keeping a notepad handy and making sure to maintain eye contact when he wanted her attention. After dinner, Walter wrote, "I've been thinking about what we found. I believe your birth mother, my daughter, discovered something illegal happening at the bank, something involving my father and Richard Coleman. Instead of listening to her, I sided with my father. That's why she ran away." Eva considered this. It aligned with what they'd pieced together, but still didn't explain what had ultimately happened to Lily. or why Susan had raised Eva as her own. She was about to respond when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You're asking questions about Lily Reed. Dangerous questions. If you want the truth, come to 1782 Bayou Creek Road tomorrow at noon. Come alone. Tell no one. Especially not Walter Reed." Eva stared at the message, her pulse quickening. Someone was watching them. Someone who knew who she was, what she was looking for, and who she was with. She glanced up at Walter, who was sorting through more of Frank's papers, oblivious to the message that had just upended their investigation. She should tell him. That would be the logical, safe thing to do. But the warning was explicit. Come alone. Tell no one. Especially not Walter. What if this was her only chance to learn what happened to her mother? What if Walter's involvement somehow jeopardized that? Eva slipped her phone into her pocket. Decision made. Some risks were worth taking. The next morning, she told Walter she needed a few hours alone to process everything they'd discovered. He seemed to understand, offering to use the time to contact some former colleagues who might have records from that era. They agreed to meet back at the motel at 3. The address from the text led her to an old fishing cabin on a remote stretch of bayou south of Mobile. The wooden structure sat on stilts over the murky water, accessible only by a narrow wooden walkway that creaked ominously under her weight. The humid air hung heavy, punctuated by the calls of birds and the occasional splash of something moving in the water below. Eva hesitated at the door, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. She was miles from anywhere, about to meet an anonymous stranger who knew entirely too much about her. She touched her phone in her pocket, reassured by its presence, then knocked on the weathered door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened just wide enough to reveal a sliver of the interior, and an elderly man with rheumy eyes and a shock of white hair. "You came," he said, before seeming to realize she couldn't hear him. He opened the door wider and gestured her inside. The cabin's interior was surprisingly neat, with worn but clean furniture and walls covered in framed photographs. The old man shuffled to a desk in the corner and retrieved a notepad, a universal accommodation she'd encountered throughout her life. "My name is Thomas Grayson," he wrote. "I was First National's chief of security from 1985 to 2002. Eva's eyes widened. This wasn't some random person. This was someone from the inside, someone who might actually have answers. "You knew my mother?" she wrote back urgently. "Lily Reed?" Grayson nodded, his expression somber. He wrote slowly, his handwriting shaky but legible. "I knew Lily. Bright girl, too curious for her own good. She discovered something she shouldn't have." He walked to a bookshelf and removed a false back, revealing a small safe. After entering a combination, he withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had long since lost its stickiness. "Lily gave me this for safekeeping, a week before she disappeared. Made me promise I'd only open it if something happened to her. When I heard she'd died, I broke that promise." He handed the envelope to Eva with trembling hands. "It's addressed to Walter Reed, her father, your grandfather, but I couldn't give it to him. Not then. It would have been a death sentence." Eva took the envelope, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written in a delicate flowing script she'd never seen before but instantly recognized as her birth mother's handwriting. The letter began simply, "Dear Dad, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I hope it hasn't, but I'm not naive. I know what these people are capable of. I'm pregnant. The baby's father works at the bank. You met him once, though I don't think you'd remember. He's the one who showed me the discrepancies in the pension fund accounts. Hundreds of millions, Dad. Siphoned through shell companies and offshore accounts. Your name was used to authorize the transfers, but I know it wasn't you. It was Grandpa and Richard Coleman. When I confronted Grandpa, he didn't deny it. He told me to keep quiet, that he was protecting the family legacy. When I threatened to go to the authorities, he said he'd make sure I disappeared before anyone would believe me. I'm leaving tonight. Susan Miller, Frank's wife, she's going to help me. She was a nurse at Grandpa's medical charity. She knows things too. Experimental drugs being tested without proper consent. Side effects being covered up. We're going to expose it all. If something happens to me, please find my baby. Protect them from Grandpa, from all of this. I love you, Dad. I'm sorry for all the horrible things I said before I left. You were right about some things, wrong about others. But you were always my dad, and I never stopped loving you. Lily. Eva's hands trembled as she read, tears blurring her vision. This was her mother's voice, reaching across decades and death to tell her story, to explain why she'd disappeared, why Eva had grown up without her. Grayson was watching her with sad, knowing eyes. When she looked up, he handed her another note. Your mother was brave, too brave. 3 days after she gave me that letter, she disappeared. A week later, your grandmother, Walter's wife, was committed to a psychiatric facility after claiming her husband had done something to their daughter. 2 weeks after that, Susan Miller showed up with a baby, you, claiming you were her sister's child. I knew better, but I kept quiet. We all did. Eva stared at him, anger bubbling up through her grief. Why? She wrote, the single word underlined 3 times. Why didn't you help her? Grayson's weathered face crumpled with shame. Fear, he wrote. The old man, Walter's father, he had connections everywhere, police, judges, doctors. Nobody crossed Howard Reed and survived with their reputation intact, or sometimes at all. He reached for another piece of paper. Your mother died in 2003. Car accident, they said. But the car was never found. Neither was her body. Just a death certificate signed by a doctor who retired to the Cayman Islands a week later with a brand new yacht. Eva felt like the floor was tilting beneath her. Her birth mother had been silenced, murdered most likely, to protect powerful men from the consequences of their crimes. Her grandmother committed for trying to discover the truth. And Susan, the woman who raised her, had been part of the conspiracy of silence that had robbed Eva of her real family. But there was one glaring inconsistency in this tale of corruption and cover-up. Walter. Her grandfather had seemed genuinely shocked by the drawing, genuinely grief-stricken over Lily's disappearance. Either he was an Academy Award-caliber actor, or he truly had been kept in the dark about what his father had done. Walter Reed, she wrote to Grayson. Did he know? Was he part of this? The old man considered the question for a long moment before responding. I don't believe so. Howard kept him focused on the international side of the business in those days. I think Walter was as much a victim of his father's machinations as Lily was. Eva gathered the letter and notes, her mind racing. She needed to show these to Walter, to compare them with what they'd found at Frank's house. The full picture was emerging, darker and more complex than she could have imagined. As she stood to leave, Grayson caught her arm gently. He pressed one final note into her hand. Be careful. Howard Reed may be dead, but the people who helped him cover this up are still out there, and they've had 28 years to bury the evidence even deeper. The Bayshore Inn parking lot was empty, except for Walter's Audi and a nondescript black sedan when Eva returned from her meeting with Grayson. She clutched the manila envelope containing Lily's letter like a talisman, both eager and terrified to share its contents with Walter. The truth it contained would irrevocably change him, just as it had changed her. She found him pacing the length of his motel room, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing emphatically. When he saw her in the doorway, relief flooded his features. He quickly ended the call and crossed to her. Where were you? He wrote hurriedly on the notepad. I've been worried sick. Eva hesitated, then handed him the envelope. I received a message, she wrote beneath his question, from someone who knew Lily, who knew what really happened. Walter stared at the envelope, recognition dawning as he saw his name written in Lily's handwriting. His hands trembled so violently that he had to set it down on the bed to open it. Eva watched as he read, witnessing the transformation of a man in real time. His face, already lined with years of grief, seemed to collapse in on itself. The carefully maintained composure of a banking executive crumbled, revealing the raw, wounded father beneath. He sank to the edge of the bed, one hand covering his mouth as if to physically contain the sob that threatened to escape. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a devastation so complete that Eva instinctively moved to sit beside him, placing her hand over his. My father, Walter wrote eventually, each word appearing to cost him tremendous effort. My own father did this. He threatened Lily, drove her away, all to cover up his crimes. He paused, pen hovering over paper, and I let him. I believed him when he said she'd run off with that boy. I was angry at her for weeks before I even started looking. Eva squeezed his hand. It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't sure she had the right to offer that, but it was acknowledgement of his pain, of the manipulations that had shaped both their lives. Walter straightened suddenly, a new resolve hardening his features. "We need proof," he wrote. "Not just Lily's letter or Frank's wall or an ex-security chief's testimony. Hard evidence that will stand up in court." He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "I've been making calls. One of my old colleagues, retired now, says there are sealed board records from that period. Minutes from meetings my father held with Coleman and others. Documents that were supposed to be destroyed but weren't." Eva leaned forward eagerly. "Where?" she wrote. "In a storage facility owned by the bank. In Birmingham." Walter's expression darkened. "But there's a problem. Someone knows we're looking. That call just now? It was Jessica, my assistant. The branch manager you encountered, Coleman Jr., has been making noise. Claims I'm mentally unstable, conducting a witch hunt against his family for personal reasons. He's petitioned the board for an emergency meeting to discuss my removal." Eva felt a chill. Coleman must have connections to those who helped cover up the original crimes. The son protecting the father's legacy, just as Walter had once unwittingly done for Howard. "How long do we have?" she wrote. "The meeting's tomorrow afternoon." Walter checked his watch. "We need to get to Birmingham tonight, find those records, and get back to Montgomery before the board convenes at 3. Eva nodded firmly. This was their chance, perhaps their only chance, to uncover the truth and hold the responsible parties accountable. For Lily. For all of them. 3 hours later, they stood in the shadows of a massive storage facility on Birmingham's outskirts. The building loomed against the night sky, its rows of windows dark except for the security lights that cast eerie pools of illumination across the parking lot. Walter had changed from his business casual attire into black jeans and a dark sweater, clothes he'd purchased at a roadside department store on their way north. Eva, similarly dressed in all black, couldn't help but think how surreal this was. 24 hours ago, she'd been a waitress with a modest life and limited prospects. Now she was breaking into a bank facility with the institution's CEO to uncover a decades-old conspiracy. Walter used his executive access card to enter the building, but his credentials wouldn't open the records room on the 3rd floor. They'd anticipated this. Why else would they be dressed like cat burglars? But it complicated matters. "Old school," Walter mouthed clearly so Eva could read his lips. From his pocket, he produced a small toolkit and set to work on the lock. Eva raised an eyebrow, and Walter had the grace to look sheepish. "Misspent youth," he wrote quickly on his phone. "Before banking." The lock eventually yielded, and they slipped into a vast room filled with row upon row of metal shelving units. Boxes labeled by year and department stretched as far as Eva could see in the dimness. Walter used his phone's flashlight to illuminate the classification system, then pointed toward the far corner. 1997, 1998, he mouthed. Board documents. They moved quietly through the archive, aware that even at this hour, security guards might be making rounds. The box they sought was stored high on a top shelf, requiring Walter to drag over a step stool to reach it. Inside were leather-bound minute books, correspondence files, and a series of financial reports stamped "Confidential, board eyes only." Walter's expression grew grimmer with each document he examined. "My God," he wrote, showing Eva a memo bearing Howard Reed's signature. They weren't just embezzling from the pension fund. They were laundering money for the Dixie Syndicate. Eva's eyes widened. The Dixie Syndicate, a notorious crime organization with tentacles throughout the Southeast, had been headline news in the late 90s when federal prosecutors had tried and failed to bring down its leadership. Walter pulled out more documents. Spreadsheets showing hundreds of millions flowing through First National's system, phantom accounts opened and closed in rapid succession, property transactions with inflated values, and most damning of all, a list of annual consultancy payments to various recipients, including judges, police officials, and a district attorney. "This is why my father was so desperate to silence Lily," Walter wrote, his handwriting becoming increasingly unsteady. This wasn't just financial crime. This was organized crime infiltrating the banking system. If this had come out, he couldn't finish the thought. Eva placed her hand on his arm, steadying him. She pointed to a file labeled Reed L. Personal. Walter opened it with visible trepidation. Inside was a surveillance report compiled by a private investigation firm. It detailed Lily's movements after her disappearance, including her connection to Susan Miller. Photographs showed a visibly pregnant Lily entering a clinic. Medical reports documented the birth of baby girl Reed and subsequent treatment with an antibiotic called neomycin X. And at the back of the file, a handwritten note from Howard Reed to Richard Coleman. Problem solved. L will not be an issue going forward. Miller woman agreed to take the child in exchange for immunity and $50,000 annually. Ensure all traces of neomycin X testing are eliminated from official records. The girl's deafness is an unfortunate but acceptable collateral outcome. Walter stared at the note, written in his father's unmistakable hand, his face a mask of horror and revulsion. Ava felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Her deafness, the defining aspect of her identity, had been not a natural occurrence, but a calculated collateral outcome of her great-grandfather's machinations. "We need to go," Walter wrote suddenly, stuffing key documents into his backpack. "Now, we have what we need." As they turned to leave, the overhead lights suddenly blazed to life. Standing in the doorway was a security guard, and beside him Thomas Coleman, the branch manager from Montgomery, his thin lips curved in a triumphant smile. "Mr. Reed," Coleman said, his voice dripping with false concern that Eva could read clearly on his lips. "I'm afraid the board is quite concerned about your unstable behavior, breaking into company archives in the middle of the night, stealing confidential documents. This won't look good at tomorrow's hearing." Walter straightened to his full height, the documents clutched protectively against his chest. "These records," he said clearly, making sure Ava could see his face, "prove that your father and mine conspired in money laundering, embezzlement, and potentially murder. They're not staying buried any longer, Coleman." Coleman's smug expression faltered. "You're making wild accusations based on ancient history," he said, but Eva could see the fear creeping into his eyes. "No one will believe you." Walter smiled grimly. "That's where you're wrong. The beauty of being CEO, even temporarily, is that when I call a press conference, people show up, and I've already scheduled one for noon tomorrow." Coleman's face drained of color. He turned to the security guard. "Detain them, they're stealing company property." But the guard hesitated, looking uncertainly between the powerful CEO and the agitated branch manager. In that moment of indecision, Walter grabbed Eva's hand and they bolted past, documents secured in Walter's backpack. They ran through the darkened archive, down the emergency stairs, and out into the night. Behind them, alarms began to wail, but they were already in the Audi, tires squealing as Walter accelerated out of the parking lot. Eva's heart pounded with fear and exhilaration. They had the proof, undeniable evidence of corruption at the highest levels of First National, of Howard Reed's crimes, of what had truly happened to Lily. But as the Birmingham skyline receded in the rearview mirror, she couldn't shake a cold certainty. Thomas Coleman wouldn't simply let them walk away with the means to destroy his family's reputation and possibly send his father to prison. The most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. Dawn painted the Alabama sky in watercolor strokes of pink and gold as Walter's Audi sped north on Highway 65. Neither he nor Eva had spoken or written much since their hasty escape from Birmingham. The documents in Walter's backpack weighed on them both, their revelations too heavy for casual conversation. Walter's phone had been buzzing incessantly for the past hour. Calls from board members, from his assistant, from the bank's legal counsel. He'd ignored them all. There would be time for explanations later, after they'd completed one final crucial task. Eva watched the scenery blur past her window, exhaustion pulling at her eyelids. In the space of 3 days, her entire identity had been dismantled and reconstructed. She was not Eva Miller, daughter of Susan, a deaf waitress with modest dreams. She was Eva Reed, granddaughter of Walter, great-granddaughter of Howard, daughter of Lily, a young woman who had died trying to expose corruption that ran deeper than any of them had imagined. And her deafness, the condition that had shaped her interactions with the world since infancy, had been no accident of nature. It had been a collateral outcome, as Howard Reed's cold note had put it, a side effect of an experimental antibiotic administered without proper consent or oversight. Walter tapped her arm gently, breaking her reverie. He nodded toward an exit sign for Cullman County, then scribbled on the ever-present notepad propped against the steering wheel. Almost there. Eva nodded, her stomach tightening with apprehension. According to Lily's death certificate, this rural county was where her mother had allegedly died, though no body had ever been found. Walter had made a few calls during their frantic drive, pulling strings and calling in favors to track down information that had been buried for decades. They turned off the highway onto a narrow country road that wound through dense pine forest. After several miles, Walter slowed and turned again onto an even narrower dirt track, barely visible among the underbrush. The Audi's suspension protested as they bounced along the rutted path. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by an ancient oak tree. Beneath its spreading branches stood a solitary headstone, weathered and neglected, half covered in creeping moss. Walter parked, and they sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the lonely grave through the windshield. This remote spot was where all their investigations, all their discoveries had led them. To this forgotten corner of Alabama where someone, perhaps Lily Reed, perhaps not, had been laid to rest without ceremony or witnesses. When they finally stepped out of the car, the morning air was already heavy with humidity, promising another scorching September day. Insects buzzed in the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called out its melancholy refrain. Walter approached the headstone slowly, as if afraid it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Eva followed, her legs feeling curiously numb beneath her. The stone bore no name, no dates, only a small, crude etching of a carousel horse that made Walter gasp aloud when he saw it. Lily drew these, he wrote with a shaking hand, everywhere. In her notebooks, on napkins, on the margins of her homework, always carousel horses. He fell to his knees before the headstone, one trembling hand reaching out to trace the weathered etching. 28 years of grief, of uncertainty, of guilt crashed over him in a single overwhelming wave. His shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. Eva stood helplessly beside him, her own tears flowing freely down her cheeks. This was her mother's grave. The woman who had given her life, who had tried to protect her from Howard Reed's machinations, who had ultimately paid the ultimate price for her courage, lay beneath this unmarked stone. After what seemed like hours, Walter composed himself enough to write again. I failed her, as a father. I should have believed her, protected her. Instead, I let my father poison everything. Eva knelt beside him, taking the pen from his hand. You didn't know, she wrote. He deceived everyone. Walter shook his head, unwilling to accept the absolution she offered. I suspected something was wrong with the bank's finances. Lily tried to tell me. I dismissed her as a dramatic teenager. Fresh tears spilled from his reddened eyes. My last words to her were, when you're ready to be rational, we can talk. She walked out the door, and I never saw her again. Eva placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling the shudders that ran through his body as he confronted the full magnitude of his regret. There was nothing she could say to ease this pain. Some wounds were simply too profound for consolation. They sat together in the dappled shade of the oak tree, two strangers connected by blood and tragedy, each lost in private grief for the woman who had connected them across decades of silence. After a while, Walter pulled a small gardening trowel from his backpack, purchased during their pre-dawn stop at a 24-hour superstore. With deliberate movements, he began clearing away the moss and weeds that had nearly reclaimed the headstone. Eva joined him, working silently alongside her grandfather as they performed this small act of remembrance for Lily. When they had finished, Walter retrieved an envelope from his pocket and extracted a faded photograph. Lily at 16, laughing on the carousel that had featured in her drawing, in Walter's wallet, and now on her grave marker. He propped it carefully against the newly cleaned stone. We brought something else, he wrote to Eva. Something that belongs here. Eva nodded, understanding immediately. She returned to the car and retrieved her aluminum lunchbox, the humble container that had started their extraordinary journey. From it, she took the childish drawing that had connected them in that Montgomery bank just 3 days ago. Together, they dug a small hole at the base of the headstone. Eva carefully placed the drawing inside, now protected in a waterproof sleeve Walter had thought to purchase. They covered it with earth, burying the artwork where it belonged, with its creator. As they stood to leave, Walter's phone rang again. This time he answered, his voice hoarse but determined as he spoke words Eva could not hear but could read in the set of his jaw, the straightening of his shoulders. When he ended the call, he turned to her with renewed purpose. That was Jessica, he wrote. The board meeting has been moved up to noon. Coleman's father, Richard, plans to attend. They're voting on my removal. A grim smile played at the corners of his mouth. They have no idea what's coming. Eva nodded, a matching determination hardening her own resolve. They had the documents. They had the truth. Now it was time to use them. As they walked back to the car, a sudden gust of wind stirred the branches of the oak tree, sending a shower of golden leaves spiraling down around them. One leaf landed on Eva's shoulder and she paused, feeling an inexplicable sense of presence, as if, just for a moment, her mother had reached out to touch her. She turned back toward the grave and, using the signs Susan had taught her as a child, formed words with her hands that needed no translation. "I found him, Mom. I found my grandfather." Walter watched from a respectful distance, witnessing this silent communion between mother and daughter, a connection that transcended death, deception, and decades of separation. When Eva finally turned away from the grave, there was a new lightness in her step, as if some burden had been lifted from her shoulders. They drove away from the little clearing with the unmarked grave, leaving behind a piece of themselves but carrying with them a renewed sense of purpose. The past could not be changed, but the future, that was still theirs to determine, and they would begin by exposing the truth, no matter the cost. As the Audi rejoined the highway heading toward Montgomery, toward the confrontation that awaited them at First National's corporate headquarters, Eva reached over and squeezed Walter's hand. No words were necessary. They were family now, bound by blood, by loss, and by the promise of justice too long delayed. The First National Banking Group headquarters in downtown Montgomery was an imposing glass and steel monolith that cast long shadows across the surrounding buildings. On this particular Thursday, those shadows seemed to Eva to hold a deeper darkness, the accumulated secrets of 3 decades threatening to spill into the light. Walter adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror before exiting the car. He'd changed back into his business attire in a gas station restroom 20 miles outside the city, armor for the battle ahead. Eva remained in her casual clothes, a visual reminder that she existed outside the banking world's polished facade. The lobby buzzed with nervous energy as they entered. Employees cast curious glances their way, whispering behind cupped hands. News of the emergency board meeting had clearly spread throughout the organization, though the true nature of the crisis remained known to only a few. Jessica, Walter's assistant, met them at the executive elevator, her professional composure barely masking her concern. "Mr. Reed," she said with a respectful nod toward Eva, "the board is assembled in the main conference room. Mr. Coleman, both Mr. Colemans, arrived 15 minutes ago." Walter checked his watch. 11:45. "And the press?" he asked. "Waiting in the media room as requested," Jessica confirmed, "though the board is quite confused about why you've called them here." Walter's smile held no warmth. They won't be confused for long. The executive floor was hushed when they arrived, the thick carpeting absorbing the sound of their footsteps as they approached the conference room's heavy oak doors. Walter paused before entering, turning to Eva. "Are you ready for this?" he wrote on his notepad. "Once we walk through those doors, there's no going back." Eva straightened her shoulders and nodded firmly. She had been robbed of her mother, her hearing, and her true identity by the men behind those doors. She was more than ready. Walter pushed open the doors, and all conversation in the room immediately ceased. 12 men and women in expensive suits sat around a massive oval table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. At the far end, Thomas Coleman sat beside an older man with the same thin lips and cold eyes. Richard Coleman, the former director of operations, who had helped Howard Reed cover up crimes both financial and personal. "Walter," began Elaine Hargrove, the board's current chairperson, "we were just discussing the unusual events of the past few days. Perhaps you could explain." Walter raised a hand, silencing her. "I'll explain everything," he said, his voice steady and clear for Eva's benefit. "But first, I believe the press should join us." Richard Coleman half rose from his seat. "This is an internal board matter. The press has no place." "Actually," Walter interrupted, "what I'm about to share is very much a public interest story." He nodded to Jessica, who opened the side door to admit a stream of journalists, representatives from the Montgomery Advertiser, several national newspapers, and 2 local television stations, cameras already rolling. The board members exchanged alarmed glances as the media set up around the perimeter of the room. Thomas Coleman's face had gone ashen, while his father's had flushed a dangerous shade of red. Walter moved to the head of the table, placing his backpack on the polished surface with deliberate care. Eva stood slightly to his side, her eyes fixed on Richard Coleman, the man who, along with Howard Reed, had orchestrated her mother's disappearance and eventual death. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter began, addressing both the board and the press. 3 days ago, a young woman entered one of our branches seeking to open an account. She was humiliated by the branch manager Thomas Coleman because she is deaf. He gestured to Eva, who met the curious stares with quiet dignity. What Mr. Coleman couldn't have known was that this young woman would turn out to be my granddaughter, the child of my long-missing daughter, Lily Reed. A murmur ran through the assembled journalists. The board members remained frozen, sensing that something momentous and terrible was unfolding before them. In the process of confirming our relationship, Walter continued, we uncovered evidence of criminal activity within this institution dating back to the late 1990s. Embezzlement, money laundering, conspiracy, and, I believe, murder. The murmur became a buzz of shock and disbelief. Camera flashes strobed across the room. These crimes, Walter said, his voice hardening, were perpetrated by my father Howard Reed and his co-conspirator Richard Coleman. All eyes swiveled to the elder Coleman, who had gone very still, his earlier flush draining to a sickly pallor. Walter removed documents from his backpack and began passing them to the journalists. These records, which Mr. Coleman's son attempted to prevent us from obtaining last night in Birmingham, detail how Howard Reed and Richard Coleman siphoned over $200 million from the bank's pension fund, laundered it through a network of shell companies, and used it to finance activities of the Dixie Syndicate. The room erupted in chaos. Board members half rose from their seats, demanding explanations. Journalists fired questions in rapid succession. Through it all, Richard Coleman sat motionless, a statue of a man watching his life's carefully constructed facade crumble to dust. Walter raised his voice above the din. My daughter discovered this scheme in 1997. When she threatened to expose it, she was forced to flee. She was 28 when she died under suspicious circumstances in 2003, leaving behind a daughter, Eva, who had been placed with an adoptive mother in exchange for her silence. He turned to Eva, his eyes shining with unshed tears. My granddaughter's deafness is a direct result of an experimental antibiotic administered to her as an infant, a drug developed by a pharmaceutical company owned by First National's holding corporation, a drug whose side effects were deliberately concealed to protect profit margins. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Even the most cynical journalists in the room appeared stunned by the depth and cruelty of the conspiracy Walter was revealing. Richard Coleman finally found his voice. These are baseless accusations, he sputtered, though his eyes betrayed his panic. Ancient history, misinterpreted by a man clearly suffering from delusions brought on by grief. The documents speak for themselves, Walter cut in, as does this. He played a recording on his phone, a conversation he'd had that morning with Thomas Grayson, the former security chief. Grayson's voice, thin with age but firm with conviction, detailed his knowledge of Howard Reed's threats against Lily, the surveillance operation mounted against her, and the mysterious circumstances of her death. When the recording ended, a heavy silence blanketed the room. It was broken by Elaine Hargrove, who rose slowly from her chair, her face a mask of contained fury. I move that we immediately contact the authorities, she said, her voice trembling slightly, and that we place both Thomas and Richard Coleman on administrative leave pending investigation. You can't do this, Thomas Coleman shouted, desperation making his voice crack. My father built this bank alongside Howard Reed. Everything we did was to protect this institution. No, Walter said quietly. Everything you did was to protect yourselves, at the expense of countless pension holders, at the expense of my daughter, at the expense of my granddaughter's hearing. He turned to Eva, at the expense of the truth. As security personnel moved to escort the Colemans from the room, Eva stepped forward. She took the notepad from Walter's hand and wrote a single sentence, holding it up for Richard Coleman to read. Some debts can never be repaid. The older man seemed to shrink before their eyes, the weight of his crimes finally settling fully upon his shoulders. As he was led away, his gaze never left Eva's face, as if he were seeing for the first time the human cost of his decades of deception. The press conference that followed was a blur of flashing cameras and rapid-fire questions. Walter announced his immediate resignation as CEO, his plans to cooperate fully with authorities, and his intention to establish a foundation in Lily's name to support victims of corporate crime and children with hearing impairments. By evening, the story had exploded across national news outlets. First National's stock plummeted, then stabilized as the bank's board pledged transparency and restitution. Richard Coleman was taken into custody on initial charges of evidence tampering and obstruction of justice, with more serious charges pending as the investigation deepened. 1 week later, Eva stood before Lily's grave once more. This time, she wasn't alone. A proper headstone had replaced the weathered marker, bearing Lily's full name, her dates of birth and death, and a beautifully engraved carousel horse. Fresh flowers brightened the previously neglected plot, and the surrounding area had been cleared and landscaped with native Alabama wildflowers. Walter stood a few paces back, giving Eva space for this moment. The past week had been a whirlwind of DNA tests, confirming their relationship beyond doubt, police interviews, and media attention. Through it all, they had been forming a tentative bond, grandfather and granddaughter, united by loss but also by the promise of a new beginning. Eva knelt and placed her aluminum lunchbox at the base of the headstone. She had decided it belonged here, with Lily. The humble container had served its purpose, carrying not just a simple meal but a key that had unlocked the truth after decades of lies. Walter approached slowly, holding a small wooden sign he'd had made. Together, they placed it near the headstone. It read simply, "Some balances aren't found on statements. They're found in the soul." As they walked back to the car, Walter handed Eva a folder containing paperwork for the Lily Reed Foundation. She would be its director with full authority to shape its mission and activities. It was a trust he was placing in her, not just of funds, but of Lily's legacy. Eva looked out over the peaceful cemetery, now bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. She thought of Susan, who had tried in her imperfect way to protect her, of Frank, whose paranoia had been tragic foresight, of Grayson, who had kept the truth alive until someone was ready to hear it, and of Lily, the mother she had never known but whose courage and love had echoed through the decades, waiting to be heard. Walter tapped her shoulder gently. When she turned, he signed awkwardly, but with heartfelt sincerity. "Thank you." Eva had been teaching him basic signs over the past week. He was a quick study, determined to learn this new language that would connect him to his granddaughter. She smiled and signed back. Family. It was enough. After 28 years of silence, they were finally beginning to hear each other. Sometimes the most profound connections begin in moments of our greatest vulnerability. Eva walked into that bank seeking only to open a simple account, yet discovered her entire identity had been built on carefully constructed lies. What would you have done if suddenly confronted with the truth that everything you believed about yourself was false? Would you have had the courage to pursue answers, knowing they might shatter your world completely? Walter Reed's journey reminds us that power and wealth provide no shield against the consequences of silence. For 28 years, he mourned his daughter without questioning the circumstances of her disappearance deeply enough. How many truths do we accept at face value because challenging them would be too painful? When those we trust tell us comfortable lies, do we have the strength to seek uncomfortable truths? In the end, some balances truly aren't found on statements. They're found in the soul. Eva and Walter's story shows us that healing only begins when we have the courage to face our past, no matter how painful. If this story touched your heart, please follow this channel for more powerful narratives that explore the depths of human experience. Like, share, and tell us in the comments, what secret have you uncovered that changed everything you thought you knew?